But there's a reason. There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The big, the wealthy, the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. They're irrelevant. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets, and they own all the big all the big media companies. So they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. You know something? They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they use to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all, at all, at all.
Once upon a time, there was a land that was happy and prosperous. It had a great education system, safe streets, and jobs for everyone. There were a few poor people and a few rich people. Most were in the middle. The people of this land paid for their good life by investing in their future together. They called this paying taxes. Everyone paid what they could afford. The poor people paid a little, the people in the middle paid a middling amount, and the rich people, 1% of everyone, paid more than the others. Just about everyone thought that this was best. But over time, rich people decided they weren't rich enough, so they came up with ways to get richer. The first way was through tax cuts. They didn't mind if this meant fewer services for everyone. They said, why should I care about other non-rich people? I can hire teachers, safety, waste disposal people to work for me for less money than taxes cost. And then I can keep the rest of my taxes for me. The second way rich people got richer was through tax loopholes. These are laws that allow people to avoid paying taxes, with the idea that it's beneficial for other people too, if this group didn't pay. The third way rich people got richer was to pay no taxes at all. This is called tax evasion. Of course, if all the people did this, everything would fall apart. But rich people and giant companies they owned figured no one would notice. This is illegal, but many did it anyway. And so it went. In 20 years, rich people doubled their share of the land's income. Schools, public safety, the roads, parks, libraries, public transportation all went into decline. The rich people didn't care. They said everyone gets what they deserve, and they bought their own teachers, police, garbage collectors, and transportation. They also bought something else, elections. They spent so much money on politics, they elected people who liked what they liked. More tax cuts for the rich and big businesses, and fewer schools, road repairs, police, firefighters, and nurses for everyone else. When the 99% became upset, the rich people and their politicians said, "There is no other way." They repeated this so often many people believed them. Meanwhile, instead of investing in things that most people could use, and instead of providing jobs that paid people well like they used to, rich people found they could make more money on Wall Street. Wall Street is a place where money makes money. Here, the 1% made money so fast that they devoted more and more money to it. They took some of that money and sent it far away, where workers had no rights, to produce things that workers used to produce here. When ordinary people wondered why rich people needed so much money, the 1% said, "Don't worry. This is good for you, too, because it will trickle down from us to you. Someday you'll be rich, and then the rules we made for us will be your rules, too." Some people weren't so sure about this, so the rich people bought newspapers and TV and radio stations and internet companies and paid them to repeat over and over, "Someday you will be rich, too. There is no alternative." Soon you could hear people saying, "There is no other way. Someday we'll be rich." Meanwhile, the rich people's money piled higher and higher, but after a while it was piled too high. One day the money fell down with a big crash. It fell down right on the houses of millions of ordinary people. It broke their houses. Then more money towers fell down. They fell on ordinary people's jobs. This is terrible. Everyone was scared. How did this happen? The government said, "We have to fix this." They were so used to rich people being rich, they immediately started printing money and giving it to rich people. But they didn't give any to the ordinary people whose houses and jobs were broken by the crash. Those people said, "You gave the rich people money to replace their money that got lost in the crash. Why aren't you giving us any to fix our houses and our jobs? They got broken in the crash, too." The government had no answer. Now the people got mad. Since they weren't sure who to be madder at, the government or rich people, they got mad at both. Rich people got worried. They thought, if the people get mad enough at us, they might take some of our money. This really upset the rich people, because they loved their money more than anything in the whole world. So they devised a plan. They called it, "Look over there." Whenever people said, "How come you rich people are getting richer while all the rest of us are losing our houses, our jobs, and our schools?" the rich people pointed at someone else and said, "Look over there." First they pointed at the people whose houses were broken and said, "Look over there. Poor people caused the crash. They built their houses in the wrong place. If they hadn't done that, the money wouldn't have fallen on them." But most people didn't believe them. So the rich people pointed at someone else this time, teachers. They said, "Look over there. Teachers have jobs and you don't. No one can ever fire them. And lots of teachers are bad. The schools are failing. Teachers are the reason. Bad teachers. Bad, bad teachers." Most people didn't believe this. They remembered the problem was the crash, not bad teachers. The rich people realized it might be safer for them if someone else pointed their fingers. So they took some of their money, and even though it was just a little bit of their money, it was a lot of money since they had so much. They helped more people get elected. These politicians pointed their fingers at police, firefighters, librarians, and other public employees. They said, "Look over there! These people are greedy. They have jobs and you don't. You don't have retirement plans and they do. They caused the crash." Some people thought this might be true. They knew someone or something had caused the money to fall. Maybe it was the firefighters. But others remembered that firefighters helped them when their houses were on fire. They also remembered it was the 1% who built the money towers that crashed on their houses and jobs. Some people even remembered those towers of money had replaced factories and jobs that people used to have. And those jobs used to have retirement plans, too. And the ordinary people remembered that the teachers and firefighters lived in their neighborhoods and shopped in the same stores and didn't seem to be the problem at all. The people looked around. They saw too many students in their classrooms. They saw their roads filling with holes. They saw when they needed help, it took longer to arrive. People began to say, maybe rich people have too much money now. And maybe our problems have something to do with the 1% not paying their fair share of taxes. And also, maybe rich people should pay the same rate of taxes they used to when our land was prosperous and more people were better off. The rich people heard these things and grew worried. They told their politicians to pass laws to prevent people from organizing, prevent people from voting, prevent people from having retirement plans. But now the people understood the problem. It was rich people who crashed the money onto their houses and jobs. It was the 1% who got politicians to cut their taxes until there wasn't enough for schools, safe streets, libraries, health care, and parks. And it was rich people blaming everyone but themselves for what had happened. This is where we are now. And we have a question. Is there no alternative? Or can the people of this land do something to live happily ever after?
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So what we've seen so far is that the wealth share of the richest Americans has begun to increase exponentially. It's increasing at a more and more rapid pace. And this isn't really anything that most people don't already know. I'm not sure if most people realize to what extent this problem is happening, but most people are aware of it. But if that's the only problem, then so what? You know, if all of it means is that you or I or the average American, the average middle-class American can't, make more money than they'd like to make, big deal. All we're going to be told is work harder, buy into the system. Someday you'll have as much money as the richest people if you just buy into the American dream and the table isn't tilted, the rules aren't skewed. You can achieve this level of wealth if you just go out and work hard. Of course, we're finding more and more through academic study that this isn't true. That, of course, the tables are tilted and that it's almost impossible for somebody to rise into these echelons of wealth. But that aside, so what? What's the big deal? If all it means is that individuals aren't going to be making as much money as they'd like to be making, then I don't know if that really means we have that much of a case to stand on. I would argue that in my opinion, I think that alone merits something needs to be done, just the disproportionate wealth distribution, but some people may not. So the question has to then become, well, what does this mean? What is this disproportionate wealth distribution translating into? And the answer is that it's translating into a disproportionate amount of control. It's control over the political system, the economic system, and through those two things, it's controlling the social structure as well. So the answer to the question is that the richest Americans have a disproportionate amount of influence on the direction that our citizenry is taking. in the direction that our society is moving towards as it evolves and grows. They have a disproportionate amount of control over the education of our children, and not just their education, but their entire lifestyles. The formation of their entire beings are in the hands of people who control a disproportionate amount of wealth. So this disproportionate amount of power is beginning to manifest itself, and we need to ask, what are the results of this disproportionate amount of control? How is this disproportionate amount of control wielded? And what does it mean for the future of this country? So we're going to begin to answer some of those questions by first looking at how we got into this position and how this disproportionate amount of control came to be and how it's wielded today.
Bad for you, bad for America.
He'll put us back on track.
Hester ran our state into the ground. Now he wants to be your senator.
Stand up. Say no.
Stand up and say no.
Bad for you, bad for America.
Vote for this guy.
Vote for this guy.
Aren't you tired of this stuff? Why is it that every election season it becomes impossible to hear the facts over all these misleading ads? And if it seems the problem is only getting worse, that's because it is. We can thank the Supreme Court for that. In 2010, they decided that it would be just fine for corporations to spend as much money as they want telling us who to vote for. Wait, why are corporations telling us who to vote for? Let's get something straight. This is a democracy, rule by the people. I'm a person, you're a person, and Chevron, not a person. So shouldn't elections be all about what people want? Good jobs, safe products, health care, responsible government, clean air and water. It turns out the vast majority of Americans want to see a lot more done on all of these things. But what people want is going to take a back seat as long as corporations can spend millions getting lawmakers elected. Oil companies have gotten politicians to block laws protecting our climate. Manufacturers have pushed through trade agreements that gut product safety and help ship jobs overseas. Insurance companies have been the first ones consulted on health reform, and giant corporations have gotten bailouts and subsidies. Maybe that's why all kinds of people, Republicans, Democrats, independents, are totally frustrated with our government.
It's the government!
It's easy to get angry, but it's time we got smart and realized that the heart of our problem is not that we have bad lawmakers. We have a democracy in crisis. 85% of Americans feel that corporations have too much power in our democracy and people have too little. 85%! Hey, that's a majority. So let's get together and take our democracy back from the corporations. It's the first and most important step in making real progress on all the issues that people care most about. So how did we, the people, lose control of our democracy to begin with? Let's go back a few centuries. Back then, there were just people. Some of them owned businesses, some of them worked for businesses. Still, there were just people. Then people invented something entirely new, the corporation. These legal entities exist independently of the people who own them. If a corporation does something that gets it into trouble, the owners can say, "Don't blame me, blame the corporation. I'm just a shareholder." When the United States came into existence, corporations were easier to keep in check. Back then, the government would grant them charters for a specific short-term project, like building a bridge or a railroad. Once they fulfilled their purpose, they were disbanded. But over time, the law changed, and corporations no longer had to be turned off once their project was complete. They began to live on indefinitely, with a much more general purpose: profit. And that's how the modern corporation was born. Today's corporations have evolved to have something very dangerous in their programming. Unlike people who are driven by all kinds of motivations, doing the right thing, love for family, their country, the planet, publicly traded corporations are now required by law and the markets to pursue one single motivation above all others: maximize value for shareholders. Make as much money as possible. That's it. No, really, that's what the law and the markets demand. Imagine a friend saying, "The only thing I care about is money." It's not someone you'd want to leave your kids with, or your democracy for that matter. Yes, it is people who run these corporations, but their human motivations come second. If they prioritize anything at all over maximizing profits, they're out of there. Can corporate leaders do good things like give to charity or try to be more green? Sure, but not if it conflicts with maximum profits. And since their humble beginnings, corporations have grown huge. 53 of the 100 biggest economies on Earth now are corporations. So corporations have a single-minded profit motive. They're humongous, and their owners can easily dodge the blame for any harm they cause. That makes them tricky to share a country with. If we want them to serve us and not the other way around, they need some basic ground rules. And that's where the government comes in, setting rules to keep things fair and safe and to protect society from corporations run amok. Now, if their main objective is to maximize profit, do you think corporations are content to follow the rules that keep them in check? No, of course not. They want to write those rules. But who is supposed to write the rules in a democracy? People. That's why one of the corporation's key strategies for sneaking into our democracy is saying that they should have the same First Amendment rights as real live people. And that's exactly how they won the 2010 Supreme Court case known as Citizens United versus FEC. In that case, 5 members of the Supreme Court decided that it's unconstitutional to put any limits on how much money corporations can spend influencing elections. Why? They said these limits violate the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech. Now, obviously, our founding fathers who wrote the First Amendment were trying to protect the free speech of people. But this decision rides on the crazy argument that corporations should be treated the same as people and get the same rights that real people get. This means corporations can spend as much as they want, whenever they want, to intimidate or crush candidates running on a platform against their interests and support candidates who will do what they ask. It's great news for corporations wanting to handpick the lawmakers whose job it is to keep them in check. Now, I am all for free speech. If every shareholder and employee at Exxon wants to personally support some oil lobbyist running for Senate, that's their right. There are millions more people who will support a different candidate. That's democracy in action. But now, Exxon or any other corporation can decide to spend unlimited dollars from its huge corporate coffers to influence an election without even consulting its shareholders. This is a big deal. If the top 100 corporations decided to throw in just 1% of their profits, they could outspend every candidate for president, House, and Senate combined. Good luck having your free speech heard over that.
So I understand from Mitt Romney that corporations are people, my friend. Well, it turns out he thinks that because corporations, of course, were helping him. And they help a lot of politicians. Really interesting story out of Huffington Post here that tracks how the new trend is if you're a human being and you can't directly give money to a politician, that's okay. You just become a corporation and then you give it to a super PAC and boom, money's laundered. So the guy who, I don't know if he really started it, but really perfected this process was Mitt Romney. Back in 2012, he got $1 million donation. That's okay, it was from a super PAC called Restore Our Future. Okay, well, it's for the super PAC, so the Supreme Court says it's okay. Well, where did the super PAC get the money from? Well, they got it from WSPAN LLC. What the hell is that? Nothing really, it's just a corporation set up by, oh, will you look at that, Bain Capital executive Ed Conrad, or Kennard. Now, that makes sense. That executive is a former co-worker of Mitt Romney and a good friend of his. Now the problem is he couldn't just write him $1 million check, but if he was a corporation he could, so he just all of a sudden became a corporation. Starts WSPAN LLC, then gives it to a super PAC, boom, boom. His friend has $1 million perfectly legally, even though if he just wrote it himself, it would be perfectly illegal. Voila. See, corporations have special rights. They have all of our human rights, and then they have rights on top of that. Okay, so by the way, it's not just Republicans doing this, it's Democrats too. Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, same little trick. He got money from a PAC called Virginia Progress, because he's from Virginia, and they want to make progress over there. But that was from a corporation, Alcantara LLC. Who the hell is Alcantara LLC? They just came about. Oh, they're connected to another corporation. They're a subsidiary of MicroStrategy. Oh, okay, good. And who is MicroStrategy's CEO? Oh, well, you look at that. Longtime friend of Mark Warner, CEO Michael Saylor. This is just how they launder the money. And Bill Allison, an expert in the field, explains, it would be against the law if a donor would come up with an alias and call himself Danny Deep Pockets and give $1 million, but it's not against the law if he comes up with it with an LLC. And an LLC is a limited liability corporation. So now they've sprung up everywhere. They're in a race for Ohio Secretary of State. $250,000 went to John Husted. And they're like, where the hell did this money come from? Well, it came from a super PAC named Advancing Freedom Action Network. I love the names. And okay, good. Where's that? Where did the money come from there? Well, it came from a corporation. You see the pattern here. And that was from American Dream Fund, LLC. Here's one thing we know. They love America and freedom and dreaming. And they also, it's okay, because they got it from a different corporation, CT Corporation System. And who did they get it from? No one knows. They're like, I don't know, man. They just keep laundering the money. At some point, it's somebody who wants a favor from John Husted. So they just gave him $250,000. And this is the legalized bribery we have in America.
Madam Chair, in the U.S. today, the top 1% own about 38% of the financial wealth of America. The bottom 60% own 2.3%. One family, the Walton family, is worth over $140 billion. That's more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. In recent years, we have seen a huge increase in the number of millionaires and billionaires, while we continue to have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. Despite this, as many of my Republican friends talk about the oppressive Obama economic policies, in the last year, Charles and David Koch struggled under these policies, and their wealth increased by $12 billion in 1 year, despite the oppressive Obama economic policies. In terms of income, 95% of new income generated in this country in the last year went to the top 1%. Now, a study which I've just introduced into the record by two professors from Princeton University, Professor Martin Gillens, and Northwestern University Professor Benjamin Page, basically suggest that while historically we have considered our society to be a capitalist democracy, we may now have entered into a phase where we are an oligarchic form of society. In your judgment, given the enormous power held by the billionaire class and their political representatives, are we still a capitalist democracy, or have we gone over into an oligarchic form of society in which incredible economic and political power now rests with the billionaire class?
So all of the statistics on inequality that you've cited are ones that greatly concern me. And I think for the same reason that you're concerned about them, they can shape determine the ability of different groups to participate equally in a democracy and have grave effects on social stability over time. And so I don't know what to call our system or how to, I prefer not to give labels, but there's no question that we've had a trend toward growing inequality, and I personally find it a very worrisome trend that deserves the attention of policymakers.
Thank you. I mean, I think the point that the professors are making and others have made is that there comes a point where the billionaire class has so much political power, where the Koch brothers are now, because of Citizens United, able to buy and sell politicians. They have so much political power. At what point is that reversible? And that is a great concern to me. I want to go to another point. Some of my colleagues, especially in the House, believe that we can improve lives for the middle class and create jobs by completely repealing the estate tax, which applies now to perhaps less than 0.1% of the wealthiest families in this country. Would it make sense to you to give enormous tax breaks to the families of the top 1% of people in this country?
So I've indicated that I share your concern with inequality, but I guess I'm going to say on this that it's up to the Congress to decide what's appropriate, and there are a number of different ways to address it that certainly is on the list.
All right. Well, let me ask you another question. Some of my friends in the House, and the Ryan budget and so forth, suggest that one way to stimulate the economy to create decent-paying jobs is to give more tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations, despite the massive wealth and income inequality we have right now. If we give tax breaks to the Koch brothers, who are worth $80 billion, do you think that's going to create a whole lot of jobs in this country?
Well, I'd say most of the evidence that we have suggests that transfers to lower income people tend to be spent, a larger fraction of a dollar is spent than when there's a transfer to a wealthy individual, but changes in tax policy, so that's from the demand side. Tax policy also has supply side effects that one should take into account.
So a question has arisen, are we still a democracy? One of the guys who actually asked that question is me, because I keep talking about how money has corrupted our politics and that at the national level, we don't really have a functioning democracy anymore because our politicians aren't listening to us. Well, that's my opinion based on all the different stories that I've covered over the last 17, 18 years of covering politics. But now some Princeton researchers, Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, actually went back and did a study on this issue. They studied 1,779 different policy initiatives between 1981 and 2002. And then they published in Perspectives on Politics, a very respected journal. It's called Testing Theories of American Politics. So let's talk about how they did it. They said they then compared those policy changes, the ones that they studied, with the expressed opinion of the United States public, comparing the preference of the average American at the 50th percentile of income to what those Americans at the 90th percentile preferred, as well as the opinions of major lobbying or business groups. So now this is a really interesting way of doing it. They take an issue, they see which way did it go in the voting, right? And then they say, all right, at the time, what was the public opinion poll on the 50th percentile? And then the top 10%, and then lobbyists and business groups. I'm on pins and needles as I'm reading the beginning of this story to see how it turned out. Well, I have bad news for you guys. Quote, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Well, that is devastating. Now remember, this is before Citizens United, it's certainly before McCutcheon. And remember that we started talking about money in politics and we started talking about Wolfpack before Citizens United. That's because, as I've told you on this show many times, the two devastating cases actually came in 1976 and 1978. In Buckley v. Vallejo, where they said money is speech, and 78, where they said corporations have First Amendment rights and can spend money in politics. Ever since then, it has been an evolving disaster. And since then, as you can see from this study, over 1,800 different policies, and you had almost no effect on them. Now, this would be generally called an oligarchy. So look, a lot of times that word is thrown out and people don't know what it means. So I think it's important to define it. Policy Mike defined it for you here, and I thought it was a good job, so let me read that to you. An oligarchy is a system where power is effectively wielded by a small number of individuals, defined by their status called oligarchs. Members of the oligarchy are the rich, the well-connected, and the politically powerful, as well as particularly well-placed individuals in institutions like banking and finance or the military. Now, usually, Russia is referred to as an oligarchy, and a lot of other countries that are run by a small set of elites are referred to as an oligarchy, but almost never the United States. Well, it turns out, in reality, going all the way back to 1981 is when it starts. We, in fact, were run by small elites. And to me, it's not damning of all the rich, right? Your doctor didn't have anything to do with this. Oprah didn't have anything to do with it. It's people who are politically powerful and actually use that power to their advantage and to your disadvantage. Now, to that point, let me go to a different set of numbers put together by other professors that recently got news too, which is very important. Let me show you a chart here of how the different percentages did in America since 1980. And it's always 1980 that it goes back to. So in fact, if you're more clear on that, it's 1978 is when all the charts start diverging. And as you can see there, you've got bottom 20%, middle 60%, and the next 19% doing okay. They're hanging in there. And look, to be fair, they're actually rising a tiny bit through those decades. But that top line is the top 1%. And they are doing spectacular. And that's not an accident. That's over decades of time. That shows you a pattern. The pattern is the rules have been fixed in their favor. Okay? Now, Has it gotten better? Look, we have had a Democratic president who lobbied and campaigned on change, and he's been in power for 5 years. In fact, as of September of 2013, since the Great Recession began in 2008, those 5 years, the top 1% captured 95% of all income gains since the Great Recession ended. Isn't that an amazing number? So when they say the economy is recovering, you have to understand something. It's not recovering for you. It's recovering for the top 1%. One more devastating fact about that, since September of 2013, the 99% saw a net 12% drop to their income. So since that's meaning the time between when the Great Recession started in 2008 to September of 2013. So unlike the earlier chart from decades ago, it's now gotten so bad, perhaps because of Citizens United adding fuel to that fire and putting the money in politics on steroids. It's now gotten to the point, even when the economy recovers, actually 99% of us still lose. Our income is no longer going up incrementally or a tiny bit, it's now going down. And after Citizens United, then we just recently got McCutcheon, which lifts even more limits on campaign financing. Look, it's not a small little issue, campaign finance reform. It's not like, oh, well, look, I have strong feelings about war, which makes sense, or I have strong feelings about the environment, which makes sense. This is about our democracy. So your opinions on war, taxes, all that stuff is irrelevant if you don't live in a democracy. If you live in an oligarchy, they don't give a damn about your opinions on those issues anyway. There's only one issue. Who controls our politicians? And if you do private financing of elections, you will have the people who gave those large donations who control our politicians. That is obvious. It's a matter of logic, and now, through this study, it's a matter of fact. One more set of devastating graphs for you. First of all, the study's conclusion on our democracy, just to be clear, is America's claims to being a democratic society are seriously threatened. Now, I tend to think that they are understating that. I think at the national level, not at the state level, not at the local level, because I've seen democracy work there, but at the national level, when you're talking about Washington, D.C., it is not seriously threatened. It's gone. It's over. I mean, look, you just saw the numbers, but I'll give you more, as I said. Here are the graphs. Average citizens' preferences, how much did it affect policy? The line is what you have to concern yourself with there, okay? Well, that's what they're talking about when they say your opinion is insignificant. It did not make any difference. Flat. Sorry. Not interested. All right, well, if all the lines are that way, you might say, oh, okay, well, at least it's fair. Let's take a look at the line for economic elites' preferences. Yeah, that's a different line. That's the line that says it was highly correlated to the policy. The policy was connected to what the economic elites preferred. That is not an accident, it is by design. And how about interest group alignments, donors, lobbyists, special interests? Also very much aligned. We do not run our government. They run our government.
So, to recap, we've seen some of the ways that wealth has started to take control of our political and social systems just on the surface. The way that this control and this wielding of money as power has become legal and has become more commonplace. We're going to move forward in the coming series of videos and take a look at who the people are that wield this control, what kind of people they are, what their belief systems are. We're going to take a look at how it affects us on a global level, not just a United States country-wide level. And we're going to start to expand on it a little bit going forward. But this is just a brief overview relative to the United States that's meant to give an introduction to the ways that power and wealth are wielded. So thank you for watching, and keep your eye out for the coming videos in this series.